So we talked about what happens inside the neuron, what happens when neurons communicate, right? We were talking about how brain has different scales of computation, right? You could do things, you could look at ion channels and how they behave. You could look at a higher level, the behavior of a neuron, and there are firing rates and stuff like that. Now we're going to go a level higher in terms of time and in terms of areas, and think about how brain areas communicate and those sorts of things. But before that, we want to talk about what sensation and perception are. And think about what is the system is trying to accomplish and how it interacts with the world. I think this is something we could have started here, but I think it's better if you cover some of the basics and low-level properties of the system before we talk about sensation and perception. So this is something that I've shown before. And this is a view of how the brain works. Now, this is a simplified view of how the brain works. This is also true of a lot of systems that we have, where you have some stimuli from the world being processed, so using some sensory system. You attend to that, you recognize it as something or something else, and then with further attention, you could actually have it in your short-term memory, you could behave on top of it, or you could add it to your long-term memory. Now, this first stage, where a system interacts with the world around it, that's what we call sensation, right? So the first stage, when the light comes through the eye, that's sensation. When you hear my voice, when the vibration, we'll talk about what these energies are. When the vibrations reaches your ears, that's sensation. That's the first stage where an organism interacts with its environment. Perception comes later. This is when after you have a sensation, you could perceive it, and perception could depend on a lot more than just the physical world. It depends on your experience, it depends on attention, it depends on the state of the system. It depends on a lot of things, and it's much harder to define. But I'll try to give you some definitions to just make you think about that. So the text here is wrong, disorganized. But if we define sensation as the first contact between the organism and the environment, so there's a stimuli from the world being sensory processed, like light on the photoreceptors. We talked about photoreceptors in our schematic example a lot, but the idea is that the light hits these photoreceptors, and that first contact that the organism has with its environment, we call that sensation. Now, this process, if everything in the brain, as I was talking about it, is either connections or neural activity. So if the brain wants to compute something, if the brain wants to process something, the first step in that process is that physical energy from the world has to become neural activity. It has to be converted to neural activity. And then that neural activity can be processed through stages in the brain. This process is called transduction, the conversion of environmental energy into neural energy. Now, today, we're going to talk a lot about the physics of the world in terms of what type of energies are out there and how do that energies get converted to neural activity. But this process is called transduction. So in the case of vision, what gets transduced to neural activity is visible light. And I'll explain why we'll call it visible light. Like, I don't know if you heard that expression, but we'll call it visible light. In the case of hearing, what is the energy in the world that gets transduced to hearing? Vibration in the air. So if we are in an environment, in a vacuum, you're not going to be able to hear me because it's the vibration in the air. As I could move so much air by myself. That's why I need these microphones so the speakers can move a lot more air in order to reach to the seats in the back, right? So it's a vibration. It's a physical vibration in the air molecules in order to reach you. In the case of touch, It's mechanical energy, right? The reason I'm feeling the podium under my fingers is the pressure that the material puts on my finger. This sort of mechanical energy gets transduced to touch, right? In the case of a smell, what is the energy that turns into the sense of a smell? What is it? Chemical. So when you smell something or someone, maybe someone's perfume or cologne, it means that chemical, like molecules, are leaving that person or that food or that flower, traveling through air to your nose, and then causing a chemical reaction in your nose, and then that's what becomes neural activity. That chemical energy becomes neural activity, and then that neural activity, you recognize it that someone's a smell or something's a smell. It's the same thing for taste. When you're tasting something, you have taste buds on your tongue, and these taste buds interact with the chemicals that are in the food, and that chemical energy becomes neural activity, and then you could recognize it as a certain taste or not. Now, what this tells you is that there are a lot of energy out there that we do not sense, and that's important. It's not that you're sensing everything in the world. There are a lot of things that we're not sensing. There are a lot of energies that we're not sensing. And we just sense a very narrow window in different forms of energies here. So you could say that we evolved our senses to capture a specific form of energy existing in the nature. And we can only perceive those forms of energy that can be transducted by our sensory system. You can imagine it could be different for a different animal. It could be very different for a physical system that we build ourselves, and it's very different. Um, we'll talk about that. So I talked about visible light. The reason we call it visible light is because light is a spectrum. Right? There's not just what we see is just a narrow window of the frequencies that are out there in the world. So if you look at the entire wavelength of light, and I'll talk about what these mean, there's a small narrow bound of it that we could perceive. So let me define a couple of things, and then we'll come back to that. Light travels in waves, and it travels through air. If you one way to think about this, imagine if you have a rope that is attached to it at one end, or someone is holding that at one end, and then you take one side of it and you just move it up and down. It's going to create waves in the rope, and the wave travels from the point that you're creating it to reach the end, right? It has a certain speed. When you initially start it, that travels, it goes all the way down to the other end of it. If you drop a stone in water, you see that the waves start from the point that the drop happens, and then it travels to go to the next point, and it dissipates for different reasons. But the idea is that certain things travel through waves in the world, and light is one of them. The distance between the two peaks. So when I was talking about the rope, you can imagine if you really just slowly move up and down, the waves have a much bigger wavelength, which means the distance between every two peaks. If you actually move the rope very quickly up and down, what happens is that there would be a very small wavelength, which is the distance between the two peaks again. Does that make sense? So wavelengths, if we have a wave, you could either talk about its wavelength or you could talk about its frequency. And these are just the same concept, but the inverse of that. If you have a really big wavelength, it means that if you take a window of time, you have very few peaks in there. Does that make sense to everyone? So I used this example last year. If you if you call your mom often, right? The distance between every two call would be short, right? If you call your mom every day, your, the distance between every two calls is 1 day. The number of calls in the week is bigger versus if you call your mom every other day. Does that make sense? So the wavelength, the length between every two peaks, when it's shorter, it means that the frequency of those calls is higher. Does that make sense to everyone? The relationship between wavelength and frequency? Light also travels in the world through these waves. So, for example, when light leaves the surface of the sun, how long does it take to reach Earth? How long? What was the answer? No, no. The sun. So if when the light leaves the sun, it travels through the air, the space, and then comes into the Earth's atmosphere and reaches Earth. But how long does that take? 8 minutes. About 8 minutes. So when you see the sun, when you look at the sun, you're not seeing the sun as it is right now. Does that make sense? You're seeing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. It's not instantaneous. It takes 8 minutes for the light to reach your eye, for the photon to reach your eye. So the light from the sun, it travels through the air like that. And it travels in different wavelengths. So all of these wavelengths actually are emitted by the sun. So the sun is like really hot and burning, so it has all this spectrum of light. Let me go to this one. So you have some idea of what wavelengths are, right? When I say visible light, it's only a very small window of wavelength that is visible to us. But there are a lot of other wavelengths that are out there, and they're used for very different purposes, right? So where have you heard about ultraviolet? What? Ultraviolet. What? Fake tans? Skin cancer? Where else? Who said fake tans? Fake tans? Yeah. No, I don't. Do they? They cause cancer, though. Do they use UV rays? Interesting. I'll Google it. So a skin cancer is another example. So what does that mean? So where have you heard that you should protect yourself against UV light? Yeah, so like, like a skin protector, right? Those are when you go to the beach and you're told to put sunscreen, right? You're trying to protect your skin against a certain kind of light. It's not against visible light, it's a different light. So that's why we call all of this light, which is a spectrum, as I said. So this is a different wavelength. And different wavelengths have different properties. Right? For example, X-ray, what's so special about X-ray wavelength? What's so special about X-ray? So what is special about it? That you could see bones in it? So when you take an X-ray, right, let's say my hand and part of it is broken maybe, and then I'm shining X-ray, and I'm capturing whatever passes through my hand. The property of X-ray is that it goes through soft tissues without much alteration. So if X-ray is, if you're shining as, if you put visible light, obviously nothing of it is going through the skin, right? It all gets reflected or absorbed, right? There are three things that could happen to light. When you shine light on something from any wavelength, it could be visible or non-visible. Three things could happen. It could get absorbed, it could get reflected, or it could just pass through. For example, so what's the material that visible light passes through? Glass, right? If you have a glass, visible light just goes through the glass. X-ray, it's a different wavelength. It goes through soft tissues, but it gets absorbed by bones and dense structures. So if you have a fracture or something in your bone, you could see that because it goes through that fracture. Does that make sense to everyone? So these are different wavelengths that are out there. You could imagine bigger wavelengths that are out here that are used for different purposes. They're used for TV signal, right? They're used for radio, radar. These are wavelengths that are out there that are used for communication, right? In this room, right? Our phones are receiving and sending signals, and all of those have different wavelengths that are not visible to us. Infrared, where have you heard infrared?
There's a long time ago, like cell phone have infrared communication that send information.
Yeah. So one context of it is for, let's say, remote controls, where a lot of them were used to work with infrared, where you would send the signal using infrared in this range. Where else have you heard them? Saunas. What are the use of them in saunas? What is the use in saunas?
Some people think that it's anti-inflammatory. There's not much research to support this.
So if you shine infrared light on them, it has an anti-inflammatory effect. Okay. So human bodies generate infrared. Infrared is generated by any warm body, basically, right? Have you seen infrared cameras? And what do they detect? Heat, right? So human body and other animal bodies do generate infrared signal. So we're constantly emitting infrared signal. That's why if it's a dark environment, you could still detect it. There's no visible light, but you could detect infrared light coming from the animal. You could imagine the motion detectors, like, when you walk by a house and then the light comes on, right? That it's detecting motion, and a lot of those use infrared cameras, where they're detecting heat in the environment and then they come on. So this is the visible range, and you've seen this in the rainbow. And basically what a rainbow is the refracting of basically the visible light gets, decomposed to its component, to different wavelength by the, rain, by clouds and the tears of rain. They basically decompose the light, and then you see a rainbow. But it's all in their visible light range. That's what I was trying to say. And the range goes from red to violet or purple. That's why this area is called ultraviolet. This area is called ultraviolet because it has frequencies. So look at the wavelengths. The wavelengths get bigger in this direction. It means that the frequencies get bigger in the opposite direction. So So this area is called ultraviolet because it has higher frequencies than the purple. And then this area is called infrared because it has smaller frequencies than the red. Those names are based on the visible range. Now you could imagine when visible light is visible to us because we have our sensors, our photoreceptors are able to detect light only in this range. But we can build devices that detect light and signals in other ranges as we have, right? You know, an X-ray machine is basically that. It can detect X-ray signal. It could also generate X-ray signal, and it goes through your body, and then they detect it. So when we look at something, when we look at, let's say, flowers, right? We only see what's being reflected from it. What reaches our eye is what's being reflected from something. If I'm looking at something and it's white, what does it mean for what's being reflected? Anyone know? No light is, yeah, everything is being reflected. So if you're reflecting the entire range of the visible light, if you're not absorbing anything, it's going to appear white. If you have all the frequencies in the spectrum reaching your eye, you're going to see white. If everything is absorbed, you'll see what color? You'll see black. If I'm looking at a chair and it's red, what did it mean? What's being absorbed? Everything but red. So in this visible range, if you're absorbing everything else, I don't care what happens to the rest of it. It may be reflecting everything else too. But in the visible range, it's only reflecting red. Everything else is being absorbed. So if it's only reflecting red, as I look at that chair, all these red frequency wave is coming to my eye, and then I see it as red. So as I said, like three things could happen. When light hits something, it could absorb parts of it, reflects parts of it, and parts of it goes through the object. Visible light does not go through a lot of physical objects. It goes through a special like ice or glass or some other stuff. But most of the objects in our environment actually reflect a lot of light and absorb a lot of light. So if I had a detector that detected ultraviolet light, then it would this flower may look different to it, right? Meaning that because the flower is also reflecting ultraviolet light, but we don't really detect it because we don't have the sensory apparatus for detecting ultraviolet light. But to us appears a certain way because we're only detecting visible light. Sun emits everything. It's the same frequency range that I showed earlier. This is the frequency range. When you go in the when the wavelength becomes smaller and smaller than the visible range, the light becomes damaging to tissues. So as you go higher and higher in this direction, the ultraviolet light, X-ray, and then gamma rays, we don't have gamma rays really reaching Earth that much. But ultraviolet light and X-ray are damaging to human body. They change the DNA structure if you're exposed to them too much. And as you could see, the sun really doesn't emit anything beyond ultraviolet. Like it doesn't reach the Earth at least. So you have the visible range, you have the infrared, near and far infrared, and you have the microwave TV. So everything is being emitted by sun. It's just that a window of it we could actually see. And that's why they say, even if the sun, even if it's a cloud, you still have ultraviolet. Even if you don't see it, it's still there. It's ultraviolet light. Looking at this shows how much of the sun's light or frequencies are within each of these ranges. And interestingly, it happens that most of the suns, as I showed here, the visible light is a really small spectrum of all the possible light, but it's a huge part of the sun's emission. Why is that the case? Why does it happen that the light that is visible to us, it's a big part of the sun's? Yeah, right. So the sun was here long before we were. So we're kind of evolved to the evolved sensory apparatus to detect part of the light that is not damaging to us, but it constitutes a big part of sun's frequency range. Right? We evolved, like the question, I guess it was tricky. It's the other way around, right? We evolved to detect these sorts of light because it was what's in the environment. And for an adaptive age like organism, it makes sense to detect what's out there. Um, so that's why. Okay, so um, the reason we're going through this is for you to appreciate something about um, the physics of the world impacting our sensory system, right? We evolved on this planet, and for that reason, we have sensory systems, and what we could perceive depends on what we can sense. We cannot perceive things that we cannot sense. Um, Different animals could perceive things maybe in a different range, a slightly different range. Um, and they could, or they could perceive certain things that we cannot perceive. Um, the same goes for hearing. But sound also has a frequency spectrum, right? So the same wavelengths that are showed here, this also applies to sound. If you ever looked at spectrogram of a sound, like if you're a musician or you've seen that, it shows you all the frequencies of sound that someone is speaking, right? Everything that you're saying, it has a range of frequencies. And that range of frequencies like become one word, another, like it's a complex pattern of frequencies. But the range of the range that we actually perceive is again a small range of sounds. Similar to the visible range. For light, there's a range for sound that we could actually perceive. But there are animals that could perceive higher frequencies. Like, do you know of any applications of frequencies of sound outside of our perception? Mhm. Okay. Yes. What else? What? Sonar? Yeah. So things that we don't perceive. In New York City, one application of it, what could be an application of very high frequency sounds that we can't perceive? Is that a thing? Mice? So what is the mice application? Yeah, right. That's a big application in New York City, right? Very high frequency sound that we can't perceive, but it really bothers like mice and rats. And supposedly it's a humane way of pest control. Um, yeah, so animals do perceive frequencies of sound that are outside the range that we perceive, and for that reason, we could use it for different application, right? The same way we're using these different frequencies of light for very different applications, including radio and mobile and 4G and X-rays and different stuff. We're also you could use sound. It's not as much, but you could use sound for different purposes outside of the range that we could hear. Any questions about this? Yeah.
For sound, just related to pitch, or is it also, does that include tone? Or like,
Don't think it's related to tone. I think it's pitch,
Just-
just pitch.
Yeah, I have a question about this slide where it's showing the sun's frequencies. And so you said that what we perceive depends on what we can sense.
Mhm.
But then this is making a statement about the sun independent of our experiencing it or perceiving it. And so it seems, I don't know, it seems like some difficulty might arise that we're saying something about the sun in itself. And it just so happens that what the light that the sun emits is what we perceive. And I mean, I just imagine that our ways for detecting light frequencies that are outside of our sensory categories
Yeah.
are limited.
Are limited.
Like we have limited ways to measure or to capture light frequencies that are outside of the mind's concepts, of the mind's perceptual framework.
So
It just seems, I mean, it just seems like it seems almost like a coincidence that what the sun is emitting in itself just so happens to be what we can perceive, what we're built or evolved to perceive. Like
why would it be a coincidence? No, no. Okay, so we're talking about like we've evolved to have certain sensory apparatus, right? We've evolved to sense certain things in the environment. Now, because we've evolved on Earth, and Earth happens to have sun's light in it, right? Certain frequencies. It was important for survival for two reasons. One, most of the sun's emitted light should not be harmful to us, right? Which means that any animal that find, let's say, infrared light harmful would have never survived on Earth to even come to this point. You see what I mean? Because, well, or they go underground, like they go, you hide from the sun. And we've evolved sensors for the light within a range that is very abundant on the surface of the Earth, because that's where we evolved. So I think it's, as I said, it's the other way around, that we evolved to have senses, and we'll talk about what those senses are. Like, what does it look like in the eye, where we can sense the visible light, but it just, we've evolved to sense what's in the environment.
What's that little break?
This is just because it's kind of skewed. That's because there's a lot going on all the way down here. So it's just this is just the convention in graphs that you're saying there's a lot of things that are emitting in between. It means that it just follows down smoothly, but for the sake of showing the figure, you omit. That's just a convention. Doesn't mean anything. Yeah, so as I said, we talked about that. For us to appreciate, there are certain things that we could sense, and then from that we could build a perception. But there are a lot of other energies, and this is just a spectrum. It's not that there's nothing special about visible light necessarily, other than, well, we have certain photoreceptors that are only sensitive to frequencies within that range. Right? Our photoreceptors are sensitive to that frequency range, and we'll talk about them more. Okay, so sensation, as we talked about, is really the first contact between the organism and the environment. So, as I said, when the light hits photoreceptors, that's sensation. Perception is much harder to define, right? Perception becomes now dependent on a lot of other stuff, on our experience and something like these are two attempts, our conscious experience of objects and object relationship. Another not great attempt, individual's personal theory of reality, right? What you think is the real things that are out there. So perception becomes much harder to define, and cognition is even harder than that to define. It's we gotta accept it for what it is. Like it's a collection of things, and um, and we kind of accept it for not having a specific definition. Okay, so perception is subjective. It's influenced by memory, context, meaning, and experience. Um, I wanted to do a little experiment. I don't know if I ruined it. All right, let's do a little experiment. I want people on this side to close their eyes, right? On that side of the room. All right, keep them closed. On this side, look at what this figure is, okay? You've seen it? All right, now close your eyes. The other people open your eyes. All right, see this figure. All right, I've seen it. All right, now you close your eyes too. So everyone open your eyes, and then I flash something, and then you have to say out loud what the object is. Okay? 1, 2. What did you say? You guys said space, and you guys are saying rat or rat. Is that? So, or a mouse. So, simple experiment. I showed some people this image, and then when you looked at that, and then you came here, you still saw the mouse. And some people saw this image, and then when we came here, they saw a face. So very simple experiment to show that your immediate experience impact what you perceive. Supposedly the sensation here is the same. So you all sense the same thing when you're looking at this, but your perception can differ just because the way you were cued. Cueing, what we did here is cueing. And cueing experiments are very popular in psychology. You'll come across them a lot in terms of like you could fear condition people, like you could show something and then they would be more attracted to fearful stuff or for addiction or other stuff. Like they're all over the place. Here's another example. You may have seen this. But if you haven't, do you see anything here? For those of you who have seen this the first time. Do you see it? What is it for those of you who have seen it? So there's a dog here. Yeah. Are you seeing the dog? Are people seeing the dog? Yeah, so this would be the head, front legs, back legs. So it would be somewhere here. So it's like a Dalmatian. And some people see a tree here or something. So again, the sensation was staying the same. You were sensing the same thing. The same photoreceptors were being active on the eye. But the perception changes. And when you go from not seeing anything to seeing something, what does that feel like? There's a gap, right? From not seeing anything to being, look, I see something. So sometimes there is this perception gap from just seeing a jumble of simple, pieces of black and white. These are called, I think, Mooney pictures, which are binary, black and white, to seeing something. And there's an aha moment that there's perception. Question?
Yeah, it's like the Gestalt theory.
Not exactly. I think we'll talk a little about Gestalt later. But that's more about
Because we are connecting like dots and Gestalt theories like similar, like because this is actually a lot of dots and it's correct saying I see a lot of dots, but what you interpret is like I see a dog is also correct because you're closing the Gestalt circle.
So, as I said, we'll come back to Gestalt stuff later, but the idea is more that it's about principles that you use to group things without necessarily a top-down understanding. Here, in order for you to group these pieces as a dog, you have to have a concept of a dog. So the concept drives the grouping. With Gestalt, concepts are more bottom up that drive grouping, right? Things that are not close to each other, you group them as the same. Like I group all these seats as the same versus all these seats. I don't have to know their seats, so I don't. So it's different. But we'll talk about it at some point. Here's another example. Do you see what do you see here? So there is one woman that I think that would be the eye and the ear looking away. And then there's another person. There's another person that this would be the nose, the mouth. Do you see all of this? Do you see the two? And then after you have the perception, does it go back and forth? Right? So this is called bistable perception, where you're perceiving one thing and then you're perceiving the alternative and then you go back and forth between them. This happens with a lot of different bistable perception where you go back and forth. This happens with certain cubes. I don't know if you've seen them. Like cubes can actually be convex and concave sometimes when you're looking at a cube. Bistable perception is really the experience of two different percepts despite an unchanging physical stimulus. In a way, again, these examples are supposed to show that while the sensory input is not changing, while the sensation is not changing, the perception could be different. So for the same sensory input, you could have different perceptions at different time points, and you could have different perceptions for different people. So perception, as we talked about it, is subjective. It is influenced by our memory, the context, the meaning of things, our experience. We showed like a few examples of it. The reason being, while sensation, you could say, is a physical thing, right? In a way, you're saying, well, when we're looking at this, we both have these red wavelengths hitting our eye. But this could mean something different to you, right? The concept of the red doesn't exist in the world. The concept of red just exists in your brain. It exists in a society. A different society could have a different set of colors and different classification of colors. So the concept does not exist in the physical world. Like I hope today's lecture kind of brings you to that point in a way that the concept only exists in your head and in a society, right? It's not just individual that defines a concept, but a group of people define a concept. The physical properties, however, are the same, right? We're all getting the same wavelength the red wavelengths coming back from this object. It's just that when it enters your brain, then it becomes something else. Like it becomes it cues a lot of your experiences. When was the last time we had Apple or all of those things? So perception, you could say, is a blend of physical and mental realities. So when you sense something, the transduction happens, and then this pattern goes into your brain, and it becomes something that you have experienced. It becomes bound to all your experiences. So the idea is that we care about the physical properties of the stimulus, but we also care about all the perception effect that it has. Obviously, there are a lot of aspects of perception that are shared among humans and among subjects or animals. So we're interested on those aspects, obviously, but it could also be subjective experiences that are unique to an individual. So I showed this perceptual cycle before, and I'm just going to use it here to contextualize some stuff. You could see that we talked about this transduction here. So you have a stimulus on your receptors. Let's just start here. You have an environmental stimulus. You attend to that environmental stimulus, right? I can attend to a sound in the environment. Then the stimulus hits my receptors. It gets transduced. It gets processed based on my knowledge. It could become perception. I could recognize it as my own name, and then I could act by responding to it. So in a way, all organisms are functioning in, this is very simplified. There are obviously there are a lot of internal motivations that drive your actions. But imagine in a simplified organism, it could work like this. It could sense its environment. It could decide what kind of action it should take based on that perception of the environment, and then take that action. And then it changes its sensory input. And then it's in a loop. As I said, this is simplified. We're not, imprisoned in some loop of sensory response cycle where we have a lot of internal, motivations and thoughts and stuff that could guide our actions. But this is a simplification. And we're going to talk about later on about attention and recognition and those sorts of stuff. But for today, just use this perceptual cycle to contextualize some of this stuff that we've learned. Questions?
I know that we look to define cognition, but just I'm wondering, is it right to think that like perception is a form of cognition? To like organize that organization makes sense.
So there are a lot of debates going on whether there is a real clear divide between perception and cognition. Some people would say, well, they're kind of the same. Some people would argue that no, perception is less malleable, I guess, and cognition is much more subjective in some ways. So there's a lot of debate going on there. It really depends on your definition. But if I give you a general response, generally people would say that perception is much more robust to variations or individual differences. So we kind of perceive things similarly. And then cognition is the level that they would allow more flexibility and individual differences. It's hard to define. For example, if I have a backpack and I give it to two people, and I say, okay, wear this backpack and let me know how heavy it is. That response is a perception. Now, let's say I put them in front of a like 5-story building and say, okay, you have to carry this backpack all the way up to the top floor. Would that change their perception of how heavy the backpack is? You see what I mean? So that how heavy the backpack is perception. And then now the cognition comes into play of, okay, now that I have to do this task, can that really impact my perception or not? And people debate that a lot, whether the decision-making and cognition that comes after that, can it really impact your perception of how heavy it was? But again, it's a debate that is not necessarily useful, I would say. But people like to debate that, like how much cognition can impact perception.
Yeah, I was wondering about hallucinations and if they can be understood like with these same processes, and if so, are they like the same thing but lacking a stimulus, or is it the same thing and maybe the stimulus goes wrong in the transduction process? Or,
So hallucination in what context?
I
Like,
think in general, it could be like hallucinogenic,
yeah.
induced hallucinations, but also I guess like psychotic hallucinations.
Yeah, I think a lot of those probably have to do, as you said, with not having any sensory input, right? If you're seeing colors and then the colors are not out there, then you're the cycle does not really get corrected by the visual reality. So we all, some people would like to say we're always hallucinating. It's just that reality corrects it, right? Meaning that, again, this goes back to what I was describing, that all these concepts are in your head. So you could hallucinate something. You could say, oh, you could call everything hallucination because it's in your head. But some of it match the reality, some of it don't. And the reason it matches reality is that you're constantly are getting sensory input from the world. So if it didn't match reality, you would know that there's a mismatch. And that sort of corrects it. In hallucination, right, you're not really closing the loop with reality. So you're kind of in your head. So in a way, it goes, as I said, you could generate, a lot of times when something it's not here is that you can generate perception. And generating perception or imagining something. You know that you're imagining it. In some case of hallucination, you know you're hallucinating. In some cases, you may not know you're hallucinating. So there are variations. But I think like the reason it does happen is because, again, everything is in your head, right? That's the idea, if that makes sense. So I said this is a simple organism. Let's take the example I used earlier. I want to build a system and put it in front of my building. So when someone walks by, it turns on the light. That's an organism. That's really, it has everything in it, right? So let's just start by sensory. What sort of senses would I have in that system? So how would you detect motion? Infrared. So let's say I only want to turn on the light when a warm body walks by. So my sensory system is infrared. So I buy an infrared camera or infrared detector. So that's the first stage. Then what do I do?
Recognize that.
Okay. Yeah. So first step, I'll buy an infrared camera and then I point it to the street. And then if someone walks by, this infrared camera will give me a signal. Based on that signal, I could decide if I want to respond to everything, right? So for example, I could have a recognition system based on that camera. What would be a desirable thing about that recognition system? What would be something that I wouldn't want, for example? What wouldn't be like pleasant? Was that?
Really loud alarm.
No, yeah, you don't want an alarm. No, but for recognizing based on that signal, right? So for example, would I want it to turn on if it was a rat? Probably not. So I want my signal to be different for a rat or a human, for example, right? So you could have a recognition system that recognizes whether it was a rat or a human. If it's a rat, you would ignore it. You wouldn't make any action. If it was a human, then it plugs into a light and then the light turns on. And then after maybe 5 seconds, if I don't detect anything, the light goes back, goes off. And then, right, you see what I mean? So the cycle has everything. It has sensation, it has attention, it has recognition, and then it has action. And then you're in a cycle. Does that make sense? So you can imagine that a much more complex system would be an organism. A simple organism would be behaving similarly, but much more complex, like a worm. A worm can sense certain things in its environment, right? It doesn't have vision, but it has other senses, right? It has chemical senses. And based on chemical senses, it could sense whether it's in danger or not. And then based on that, it could actually move away from that environment. Or based on its senses, it could imagine if it's close to food or something like that, right? So you can imagine a simple organism in the environment, it's sensing the stuff, it's perceiving them, if you like, sensation that leads to action, a lot of times you could call it perception. And then it acts in that environment. So it's good to occasionally think about these artificial systems that we build. A lot of them do have these components in them in order to act in the environment. Is that any questions?
So I'm thinking like, for example, like iPhone Face ID is infrared.
Not iPhone IDs infrared?
Yeah, I think so.
No, it can be infrared, right? It's a camera base, is it not?
Without the Face ID. But doesn't matter. It can unlock every face. It can be just one face. So it's something that you're saying, right? Programming for just one task.
So do the Face IDs work in the dark?
Yes. There's some video that
Is what?
there's some video that people are using their iPhones. There's a light thinking every now and then.
There's a light what?
There's a like a dark light thinking.
I have to look into that.
Yeah, it's
That's spread, otherwise you could just have like a picture of a face. That's all.
Well, no, I'm just saying, does it only use infrared or does it always use camera as well? That's my question. Because I wouldn't think you could recognize a face that well just with infrared. Like, so for it to be that accurate, that it only responds to your face and no other faces, it means that it's detecting some features from your face. And we'll talk about recognition in a couple of weeks. But it's detecting only the features that could differentiate your face from, 6 billion faces. Yeah, it's just a recognition, but it's a very accurate recognition or face identification to be able to do that. Yeah. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about recognition in a couple of weeks. But I'm not sure if they could work that accurately just with infrared. There must be some camera component to it.
It also seems to use the camera to create a depth
Yeah.
reader of different aspects of your face.
It has to
including
put it like a mesh on your face and then find all the key points, and then based on that, it could recognize your face. It's a complicated system. It's not simple. We're not going to take a break today because we're kind of close to the end, so we're just going to move on. So we talked about sensation and perception. The goal there was to start from the very beginning, right? We're talking about vision, how vision works, how human vision or animal vision works. But we can't just go into vision without understanding what is being sensed. And in order to talk about what's being sensed, we have to understand the physics of the world a little bit to know, okay, these are the energies and this sorts of light energy is being transducted, and that's how vision starts. So we really started from the environment, and then you go into the brain. We'll talk about visual pathways. This is a cascade of brain areas processing visual input up to a point that you could recognize something. Right? The example you had, for example, well, how do you recognize someone as being your friend? Their appearance changes a lot. From day to day, someone's appearance could change a lot. They could, shave their beard or dye their hair or cut it short or wear very different clothes. Start wearing glasses, right? Their appearance changes a lot. Your appearance changes a lot. But we're able to be invariant to all of those changes and recognize the face. So there's this cascade of processing that happens in order to become so robust to all those variations. We'll talk about different areas that are involved in this processing in the brain. As you can imagine, vision is a big part of the brain in humans and primates. For visual animals, so vision is a big part of it. There are two pathways. There's a cortical pathway and a subcortical pathway. We'll first work on the cortical pathway, and then in a few weeks, we'll go look at the subcortical pathway because it's involved in action planning. So, as we just talked about it, the stimulus for vision is the electromagnetic energy that is out there, and the sun emits it. And there's a spectrum, a small spectrum in the bigger one that we call visible spectrum, and that's what is being detected by our eyes. The function of the eye is to focus this energy, transduce it into neural signal. Focusing in this case, I'll explain what that means because we have a lens, and the eye has a very complex and elegant machinery. Transduce it into neural signal, then start processing this signal. Okay, here's a quote from Da Vinci. The eye, which is called the window of the soul, is the principal means by which the central sense can most completely and abundantly appreciate the infinite works of nature. This is really about us being visual animals and having a very rich visual experience. So the eye from the outside has different parts. You don't have to worry about these. Just know that the light only gets through the pupil. The other parts don't really let the light through. So the light gets through in the pupil. So this is the eye, and we're sectioning it from the side. So if this is the eye, we're kind of cutting a section through it like this. So now you could see half of the eye. As I said, the light comes through the pupil. There's a lens in front of the eye when the light comes, and that's where the focus in it. If you ever played around with a lens, the function of the lens in the eye is similar to the lens that you have in a magnifying glass or other stuff. It get really, or a lens in a camera. It's for focusing the eye. So when different arrays of light comes to your eye, they get bent through this lens in order to get focus on a specific location. We're not going to go into details of that. So the lights comes through here, and then the eye has a liquid here, and one of the common diseases is that this liquid goes kind of darker, and it cannot really pass the light through. But in a normal functioning eye, this is transparent, and the light goes through the liquid, and then it hits the back of the eye. Back of the eye is where the retina is. And these are the light, this is where the photoreceptors are, in the back of the eye. One specific location in the retina is called fovea. And what's special about this area, there are a few things that are special about this area, but one of them is that it's at the focal point of the lens. So if you played around with the lens, when you shine light from different angles, there's one angle that goes direct through the lens, and it does not get bent. And that's the focal point. And that's when the light comes through, and then it goes exactly through the lens, it hits this location. And hitting this location is where the foveal vision is. So if I'm looking at the tip of my finger, the light reflecting from this location falls on the fovea. That's what's special about it. It's the central vision. That's why we call it foveal vision. Now, this yellow coating that I'm showing here, which is the retina, if you take a small sample of it, as I'm showing in this small rectangle and blow it up, it has this structure. What do I have back? It has this structure, which is strange. The reason is that the photoreceptors are at the bottom of it. So these are the light sensitive sensors, right? If one were to design this system, you would put these photoreceptors on the inner layer of this coating. That's where the light comes, right? The light I'm showing here is trapped, but because the photoreceptors are at the bottom, and you have other cells, middle layer cells and ganglion cells, we'll talk about them, the light has to go through all these cell bodies in order to reach the photoreceptors. And that causes problems. One of them is that, well, the light gets scattered by these cell bodies in order to reach the photoreceptors. Another problem is that all the axons from these ganglion cells have to leave the eye somehow, because now they're all in the inner part of the eye instead of being on the outside. So they have to leave the body, leave the body of the eye. And that creates an issue. What issue does it create? There has to be a hole somewhere in the eye now for all these ganglion cells to leave the eye. That creates a blind spot in the eye. And we're going to do a little experiment to show where the blind spot is. So put your left index finger up, and close your left eye. Close your left eye, put your left index finger up, then move your right finger while keeping your eye on the left index finger, move your right finger toward the left finger. There is a place where the right index finger, the tip of it should get, you don't see that tip anymore. You get that? Does that make sense to anyone? All right. It has to be at arm length. You have to put at arm length, okay? Close your left eye. Look to your left index finger with your right eye. And keep your eye there. Now move your right index finger, and when it's about, let's say, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches, you have to see the blind, like you don't see the right index finger anymore, the tip of it. Does anyone get that? Yeah? No? Well, at the location, it should not be visible. Like the way I'm showing it in here, I'm not seeing my right index finger right now. The left eye is closed, right? You're keeping your left eye closed. Yeah? Does anyone not get it? Who didn't get it? You didn't get it? Did people get that? Who got it? Yeah, yeah, okay. So you could explain to someone who didn't get it. What that experience is like. So that's basically a hole in the eye. So why do we close one eye? Why is that we have to close one eye for this experiment? Yeah, so if you didn't, the blind spot for this eye and that eye are different places. So if you keep both eyes open, you're never gonna get a place where the hole is there. You're not gonna, so for that reason, you have to close one eye. But even when you close one eye and you look at the environment, you don't see a hole in your perception. Right? You don't see a place that there is no sensory input. The reason being, even with one eye, you kind of perceptually fill it in with its environment. You have to do an experiment in order to see exactly where, you wouldn't know it. You've looked at the world with one eye a lot, but you've never noticed that there is something missing. And the reason is that, so this is a better schematic of this. So as I was saying, these photoreceptors are kind of bent inward, And because they're all bent inward, the light has to go through these cell bodies, but also all these cell axons have to be accumulated and leave the body. And that is what the optic nerve is. If you've ever seen an eye fall out of a socket, you'll see the optic nerve. I don't know, you've seen it in the movies probably. That's the optic nerve that is connected to the eye when the eye is dangling. What's that? In a real person? No. But in the movies, you'll see it. And it's a good depiction. All right. So this is the blindest spot that we just experimented. Because as I said, there's a hole in the retina, and when there is no, and again, this is the lesson of today, when there is no sensation, there is no perception. If that part of the retina, there's a hole, the visual input that comes from that part of the world is hitting a part of the retina that there are no photoreceptors. So you're not able to perceive that part of the world. However, what happens in reality is that you could perceptually feel that thing. You're not perceiving anything from there, but the rest of the world kind of fills in that area, and we call that perceptual filling. We're gonna stop here since we didn't have a break either. Please bring in your exams and hand them over. I don't know, some people, let me stop recording.